Homer's Odyssey, Chapter 1. The Fall of Troy and the Cyclops. For 10 long years, the armies of Greece had camped upon the shores beneath the high walls of Troy. And for 10 long years, the city had refused to fall. But in the end, it was not brute strength that broke Troy's defenses, it was cunning. And the cunning belonged to a king named Odysseus, ruler of the small, rocky island of Ithaca. It was Odysseus who first proposed the idea of a great wooden horse, hollow within, built as an offering to the gods, and left outside Troy's gates, as though the Greeks had finally abandoned their siege and sailed for home. But hidden inside that wooden belly waited Odysseus and a handful of his bravest men, crouched in darkness, hardly daring to breathe, while the unsuspecting Trojans dragged the horse through their own gates, celebrating what they believed was the end of a decade of war. That night, as the city of Troy slept in drunken celebration, Odysseus and his companions slipped from the horse's hollow belly and threw open the gates to the waiting Greek army. By morning, Troy was nothing but ash and ruin, and the long war was finally, truly over. But victory, sweet as it was, would not bring Odysseus swiftly home. For fate and the anger of certain gods had other plans for the King of Ithaca, and what should have been a journey of mere weeks across the wine-dark sea would stretch instead into 10 more years of wandering, trial, and sorrow. Odysseus gathered his fleet, 12 ships in all, filled with the loyal men who had followed him to war and now longed, as much as he did, to see their homes again. They set their sails toward Ithaca, hearts lifted with the simple hope of return. Their first stop, however, brought only trouble. Blown by winds toward the land of the Sicons, Odysseus's men raided the coastal city there, as was often the custom of returning warriors in those distant days, taking provisions and plunder before preparing to depart. But Odysseus's men, flush with victory and wine, lingered too long upon that shore, and the Sicons gathered reinforcements from their neighbors inland. When they returned in force, many Greek sailors lost their lives before the ships could finally escape back to open water. It was a grim beginning, and worse winds still awaited them. A great storm, born of some restless anger among the gods, drove Odysseus's ships far off their intended course, carrying them for 9 days across unfamiliar waters, until they came at last to the land of the Lotus Eaters. This island seemed peaceful enough at first glance: gentle shores, mild breezes, inhabitants who greeted the sailors without hostility or fear. Odysseus sent 3 men ashore to explore and gather information about the local people. But these 3 men offered the sweet fruit of the lotus plant that grew abundantly across the island, ate of it eagerly, and found in that fruit something far more dangerous than any monster or storm. For whoever tasted the lotus fruit lost, in that single sweet mouthful, all desire to return home. Memory of family, of duty, of Ithaca itself, dissolved into a warm and dreamless contentment, a wish only to remain forever on that gentle island eating lotus and forgetting everything that had once mattered. When Odysseus went ashore himself to find his missing men, he discovered them sitting placidly among the Lotus Eaters, their eyes distant and unfocused, showing no interest at all in rejoining their ship or continuing their voyage home. "Come," Odysseus said, gripping the shoulder of one sailor, a young man named Perimedes, who had served faithfully throughout the long war. "We must return to the ship. Your family waits for you in Ithaca." Perimedes looked up at him with the same dreamy, contented expression as his companions. "Ithaca," he repeated slowly, as though trying to recall what the word might mean. "I do not remember why that name should matter to me." Odysseus felt a chill of fear pass through him, understanding at once the danger this island posed, not through violence, but through the gentle, seductive erasure of everything a man once was. He ordered his other sailors to drag the 3 affected men bodily back to the ships, weeping and struggling though they were, and had them bound to the rowing benches until the Lotus's influence finally faded from their minds. "We sail at once," Odysseus commanded, eager to leave behind this island of forgetting before its sweet poison could claim any more of his crew. But the dangers that awaited them next would prove far more terrible than gentle forgetfulness. Their ships came at last to a land of rocky cliffs and green pastures, inhabited as Odysseus and his men would soon discover by a race of giant one-eyed creatures known as the Cyclops. Curious and ever hungry for supplies, Odysseus led a small party ashore, carrying with them a skin of especially potent wine, a gift he hoped might prove useful should they encounter anyone willing to trade for it. They found a great cave, clearly inhabited, filled with cheeses and pens of sheep and goats, though its owner was absent at the time of their arrival. "We should take what provisions we need and return to the ships before the owner returns," advised Eurylochus, one of Odysseus's most trusted companions, casting a wary glance at the massive size of everything within the cave. But Odysseus, ever curious and perhaps too confident in his own cleverness, wished to see what manner of being called this cave home. "Let us wait," he said. "Perhaps this creature will offer us the hospitality that custom demands of hosts toward travelers." It was a decision he would come to regret bitterly. For the owner of the cave, when he returned that evening, was Polyphemus, a Cyclops of monstrous size and even more monstrous temperament, son of the great sea god Poseidon himself. Polyphemus rolled a massive boulder across the cave's entrance, sealing Odysseus and his men inside with no possibility of escape, and upon discovering the intruders, showed nothing resembling the hospitality Odysseus had hoped for. "Strangers," Polyphemus rumbled, his single enormous eye studying the trembling sailors with cold appraisal. "What business brings you to my home?" "We are travelers, returning from the war at Troy," Odysseus answered carefully, invoking the sacred laws of hospitality that governed relations between hosts and guests throughout the Greek world. We ask only for the kindness travelers are due, and in return, we offer our gratitude and the blessing of Zeus, protector of guests and strangers. Polyphemus laughed, a sound like boulders grinding together. Zeus means nothing to me, stranger. We Cyclops fear no god, for we are stronger than all of them combined. And with that, he reached out and seized 2 of Odysseus's men, devouring them before the horrified eyes of their companions, then settled down to sleep, satisfied and untroubled by what he had just done. Odysseus, watching 2 more of his men consumed the following evening, knew he must devise some plan of escape, for the Cyclops showed every intention of eating his way through the entire crew before releasing anyone from that cave. Simple violence would not serve. Even if Odysseus could somehow kill the sleeping giant, they would remain trapped forever behind the massive boulder that only Polyphemus's strength could move. So Odysseus turned to the same cunning that had brought down the walls of Troy. He offered Polyphemus the strong wine he had brought from the ships, watching with careful patience as the Cyclops drank deeply, growing increasingly drowsy and pleased with this unexpected gift. "What is your name, clever little stranger?" Polyphemus asked, his words beginning to slur from the wine's effect. "You have given me a fine gift. I shall give you something in return. I shall eat you last, after all your companions." "My name," Odysseus said carefully, "is Nobody. That is what my mother and father call me, and what all my friends call me as well." "Then nobody shall be eaten last," Polyphemus laughed, before finally succumbing entirely to sleep, his massive form collapsing against the cave floor in a wine-soaked stupor. This was the moment Odysseus had been waiting for. He and his remaining men took up a great wooden stake, which they had earlier sharpened and hardened in the fire, and drove it deep into the sleeping giant's single eye, blinding him instantly and completely. Polyphemus's roar of pain shook the very walls of the cave. "Help me," he bellowed to his fellow Cyclops who lived in neighboring caves along that rocky coast. "Nobody has blinded me. Nobody has hurt me." The other Cyclops, hearing this confusing cry, called back in confusion, "If nobody has hurt you, then you must simply be suffering some pain sent by the gods themselves, and there is nothing we can do to help." And with that, they returned to their own caves, leaving Polyphemus to suffer alone, his enemy's true identity concealed by the very cleverness of the name Odysseus had chosen. The following morning, blind and desperate, Polyphemus rolled the boulder aside just enough to let his flock of sheep pass through to their usual pasture, running his hands carefully along each animal's back to ensure no escaping Greeks rode upon them. But Odysseus had anticipated this as well, and had his men cling to the undersides of the largest rams, escaping detection through the very thoroughness of the Cyclops' search. Once safely aboard their ships, and pulling away from that terrible shore, Odysseus could not resist calling out a final taunt to the blinded giant who stood raging upon the cliffs above. "Cyclops," he shouted across the water. "If anyone asks who blinded you, tell them it was Odysseus, sacker of cities, son of Laertes, King of Ithaca." It was a moment of pride that would cost him dearly, for Polyphemus, hearing this true name at last, called out in fury to his father Poseidon, god of the sea, begging for vengeance against the man who had blinded him. "Father Poseidon," Polyphemus cried, "if I am truly your son, grant that Odysseus never reaches his home in Ithaca. Or if it is fated that he must return, let him arrive late, having lost all his companions in a ship not his own, and find only sorrow awaiting him there." Poseidon heard his son's prayer, and though he could not entirely undo what fate had already decreed for Odysseus's eventual return, he could and would make that journey as difficult and sorrowful as any mortal had ever endured. The sea god's wrath would follow Odysseus across every wave and current for the next 9 years, ensuring that what should have been a simple voyage home became instead one of the greatest ordeals in all the ancient stories. Little did Odysseus know, as his ships sailed away from that cursed island, just how long and how terrible his road home would become. Chapter 2. The Winds of Aeolus and the Isle of Circe. After escaping the cave of Polyphemus, Odysseus and his remaining ships came to the floating island of Aeolus, keeper of the winds, a minor god who ruled over a small kingdom where all the winds of the world were kept, ready to be released according to his will. Aeolus received Odysseus and his men with genuine warmth and hospitality, hosting them for an entire month while they rested and recovered from their harrowing ordeal with the Cyclops. When at last Odysseus prepared to continue his journey home, Aeolus offered a gift meant to ensure smooth and swift passage: a great leather bag, tightly bound, containing within it every contrary wind that might otherwise blow Odysseus's ships off course. "Keep this bag sealed until you reach Ithaca," Aeolus instructed. "I have trapped within it all the winds that would drive you astray. Only the gentle west wind, which will carry you safely home, remains free to fill your sails." Grateful beyond words, Odysseus took the precious bag aboard his ship, storing it carefully beneath his own seat, trusting no one else with such an important task. For 9 days and nights, the west wind carried them steadily toward home, and by the 10th day, the shores of Ithaca itself came into view, close enough that Odysseus could see the very fires burning in the hearths of his own household. Exhausted from 9 days without proper rest, having personally guarded the bag of winds the entire journey to ensure no one tampered with it, Odysseus finally allowed himself to sleep, believing his home safely within reach at last. It was in this moment of vulnerability that disaster struck. His crew, watching their captain sleep, began to whisper among themselves about the mysterious bag he had guarded so carefully throughout the voyage. "What do you suppose he keeps in there?" One sailor murmured to his companions. Gold, perhaps, treasure from King Aeolus that he means to keep entirely for himself. It would be just like him. Another grumbled, resentment building among men who had suffered so much throughout their long journey, while their captain, in their eyes, continued to receive special gifts and favors from gods and kings alike. We have earned a share of whatever riches that bag contains. Overcome by curiosity and simmering resentment, the sailors crept toward the sleeping Odysseus and carefully loosened the bag's tight binding, hoping to glimpse whatever treasure lay hidden within. The moment the bag opened, every contrary wind that Aeolus had so carefully trapped came roaring out at once. A violent tempest that immediately drove the ships back out to open sea, away from the shores of Ithaca that had been so tantalizingly close only moments before. Odysseus woke to chaos and devastation, his ship being tossed violently by winds that should have remained safely contained. By the time the storm finally calmed, his fleet found itself once again at the island of Aeolus, having been driven all the way back to where they started. "Please," Odysseus begged, standing once more before the wind god's palace, "grant us your assistance again. My men's foolishness has cost us dearly, but surely you can help us reach home once more." But Aeolus, upon hearing what had happened, refused any further aid. "If the gods themselves have decided to work against your return," he said gravely, "then it is not my place to interfere further. Leave my island, Odysseus, for I dare not anger those who clearly wish you continued misfortune, with no choice but to continue onward by their own strength and skill." Odysseus and his crew rowed for 6 exhausting days until they reached the land of the Laestrygonians, a race of giants who proved, if anything, even more dangerous than the Cyclops had been. Odysseus, having learned caution from his previous encounters, kept his own ship anchored outside the harbor while sending a small scouting party ahead into the Laestrygonian city. But these giants, unlike Polyphemus, who had at least engaged in conversation before revealing his monstrous nature, attacked without warning or mercy. They hurled massive boulders down from the cliffs surrounding their harbor, smashing 11 of Odysseus's 12 ships to splinters, then waded into the wreckage to spear the drowning, helpless sailors like fish caught in a net. Only Odysseus's own ship, which he had prudently kept at a safer distance, managed to escape this slaughter, though he watched in horror as the rest of his fleet and the hundreds of loyal men who had sailed with him from Troy were utterly destroyed, with a single ship and a much diminished crew, grief-stricken and desperate. Odysseus continued onward until they came at last to the island of Aea, home to the powerful sorceress Circe. Wary after so many recent disasters, Odysseus divided his remaining men into 2 groups, sending one under the leadership of Eurylochus to explore the island, while he remained with the other group to guard their ship. Eurylochus's party discovered Circe's palace deep in the island's forest, and upon approaching, found the sorceress singing beautifully while working at her loom. Circe welcomed the sailors warmly, inviting them inside to share food and wine, an invitation that all but the cautious Eurylochus accepted eagerly. But the food and wine Circe offered were laced with powerful enchantments, and no sooner had the sailors eaten than Circe touched each of them with her wand, transforming them instantly into swine, complete with the minds of pigs, though they retained, tragically, the full awareness and memory of the men they had once been. Eurylochus, who had remained cautiously outside, fled back to report this horror to Odysseus. "They are gone," he gasped, breathless and terrified. "Transformed into pigs, trapped in pens like common animals. We must leave this cursed island at once, before she claims the rest of us as well." But Odysseus, unwilling to abandon his men to such a fate, insisted on confronting the sorceress himself, despite Eurylochus's desperate pleading that he not risk the same transformation. As Odysseus made his way alone through the forest toward Circe's palace, the god Hermes appeared before him, taking pity on the beleaguered king. "You go to face a powerful enchantress," Hermes said, "but I will give you a gift that will protect you from her magic." He presented Odysseus with a rare herb called moly, its root black, but its flower white as milk, which the god assured him would render Circe's spells powerless against him. "When she offers you food and wine," Hermes instructed, "eat it freely, for the moly will protect you from transformation. But when she raises her wand against you and nothing happens, she will realize you are no ordinary mortal. At that moment, draw your sword as though to attack her. She will beg for mercy, and you should grant it, but only if she swears a solemn oath to cause you no further harm." Odysseus followed this advice precisely. When Circe offered her enchanted feast, he ate without fear, and when her wand proved powerless against him, she gasped in astonishment. "No mortal man has ever resisted my magic before," Circe said, backing away in genuine fear as Odysseus drew his sword. "You must be Odysseus himself, for a prophecy long ago foretold that you alone would come to my island immune to my powers." "Then you know why I have come," Odysseus said. "Release my men from whatever curse you have placed upon them, and swear that you will do us no further harm, and I will spare your life." Circe, recognizing when she had met her match, agreed readily to these terms, swearing the solemn oath Odysseus demanded. She restored his transformed sailors to their proper human forms, and rather than posing any further danger, revealed herself to be genuinely gracious once her initial deception had failed, inviting Odysseus and his entire crew to remain as honored guests upon her island. What was meant to be a brief stay stretched into a full year, for Circe's hospitality was generous, her company genuinely pleasant, and Odysseus's men found themselves reluctant to resume their perilous journey after so much recent tragedy and loss. But eventually, even Circe's comfortable island began to feel like another form of delay, another obstacle keeping Odysseus from his true home and family. "You must continue your journey," Circe finally told him, when he confessed his growing restlessness to return to Ithaca. "But before you can safely find your way home, you must first travel to the realm of the dead itself and seek counsel from the blind prophet Tiresias, who alone can tell you how to survive the trials that still await you." It was daunting counsel, for no living mortal traveled willingly to the land of the dead. But Odysseus, understanding that he had no other path forward, agreed to undertake this dark and unprecedented journey, setting his sails once more, this time toward the very boundaries of death itself. Chapter 3: The Underworld and the Perilous Passage. Following Circe's careful instructions, Odysseus sailed his ship to the very edge of the world, where the sun's light grew thin and the boundary between the living and the dead became porous enough for a mortal, with proper rituals, to cross temporarily into the realm of departed souls. There, upon a dark and windswept shore, Odysseus dug a small pit and poured offerings into it, as Circe had instructed: honey mixed with milk, sweet wine, and finally the blood of a black ram, sacrificed according to ancient custom. The scent of blood drew the spirits of the dead like moths to flame, and soon countless shades gathered around the pit, thin and insubstantial as smoke, desperate for even a taste of the offerings that might grant them temporary voice and memory. Odysseus held his sword ready, keeping the eager spirits at bay until Tiresias himself, the blind prophet whose wisdom had remained legendary even in death, approached to drink from the sacrificial blood and speak the prophecy Odysseus had traveled so far to receive. "Odysseus," Tiresias said, his voice carrying the strange, hollow quality of the dead, "you seek to know how you might finally return home. I will tell you, though the path remains difficult and fraught with danger. I am ready to hear whatever truth you can offer," Odysseus said. "Poseidon's anger will pursue you across every wave," Tiresias warned, "for you blinded his son and boasted of the deed. This anger cannot be entirely escaped, but it can be endured if you exercise caution and restraint that has not always come naturally to you. When you reach the island of Thrinacia, you will find cattle belonging to Helios, the sun god himself. Do not touch these sacred animals, however great your hunger might become. For if you or your men harm even a single one, disaster will follow that even I cannot fully soften. And if we resist this temptation," Odysseus asked, "then you alone might yet reach Ithaca," Tiresias said, "though even then you will find your household in turmoil, besieged by suitors who have overrun your palace and pursue your faithful wife against her will. You must face them with cunning rather than open force, for they are many and you will be alone, save for whatever allies you can gather." After Tiresias finished his prophecy and faded back into the crowd of waiting shades, Odysseus found himself approached by other spirits eager to speak with him, including, to his profound grief, the shade of his own mother, Anticlea, who had been alive when he departed for Troy, but had died of grief during his long absence. "My son," she said, her ghostly form trembling with emotion, despite the strange detachment that death had brought upon her. "I did not know until this very moment whether you still lived. My heart broke waiting for your return, and that broken heart, in the end, is what brought me to this realm before my time." Mother Odysseus wept, reaching out instinctively to embrace her, though his arms passed through her insubstantial form like grasping at smoke. "I never meant to cause you such sorrow. I have wanted nothing more these many years than to return home to you and to Penelope and to my son." "Then you must continue trying," Anticlea said gently. "Penelope remains faithful, though she suffers greatly under the pressure of suitors who will not leave her in peace. Telemachus has grown into a fine young man, though he too struggles beneath the weight of your absence. Go home to them, my son, whatever trials still await you on the way." Odysseus also encountered the shade of the great warrior Achilles, who had died gloriously at Troy, but found little comfort in that glory now that he dwelt among the shadowy dead. "I would rather be a poor man's servant among the living," Achilles told him, "than rule as king over all these lifeless dead. Do not envy me my fame, Odysseus, for it means nothing here in this realm of endless twilight." Sobered by these encounters with mortality's ultimate truth, Odysseus finally departed the realm of the dead, returning to his ship with Tiresias's warnings weighing heavily upon his mind, and continued his journey back toward the world of the living. And eventually, he hoped, toward home. His next trial came in the form of the Sirens, creatures whose enchanting song lured sailors to their deaths upon the rocky shores where they perched, singing promises of knowledge and glory that no mortal could resist once heard. Having been warned of this danger by Circe before his departure, Odysseus prepared his men carefully. He melted beeswax and packed it firmly into each sailor's ears, ensuring none of them could hear the Sirens' fatal song. But his own curiosity, that same trait that had led him to linger too long in Polyphemus's cave, could not resist the temptation to hear what the Sirens actually sang, even knowing the danger involved. "Bind me to the mast," Odysseus instructed his men, "as tightly as you can manage. Whatever I say or beg once we pass the Sirens' island, do not release me until we are safely beyond their reach." His men bound him securely, then rode onward with their wax-stopped ears, unable to hear anything but the ordinary sounds of sea and wind. But Odysseus, his ears left deliberately unstopped, heard the Sirens' song in its full, terrible beauty, voices promising him knowledge of all things past and future, praise for his cleverness that exceeded even his own considerable pride. Whatever secret desire lay hidden in his heart, sung back to him with irresistible sweetness. "Release me," Odysseus begged, straining desperately against his bonds. "I must go to them. Please, I beg you, let me go." But his men, following his own earlier instructions precisely, only bound him more tightly and rowed on with greater urgency, until at last the Sirens' island faded behind them, and their song grew faint, then silent, leaving Odysseus exhausted and trembling, finally released from his bonds once the danger had passed. No sooner had they escaped the Sirens than an even greater trial awaited: the narrow strait between Scylla, a monster with 6 ferocious heads who devoured any sailor within her reach, and Charybdis, a massive whirlpool that could swallow an entire ship whole. Circe had warned Odysseus that no ship could pass this strait entirely unharmed, and that it was wiser to lose a few men to Scylla's grasping heads than risk the ship entirely to Charybdis's devouring depths. Steeling himself against this terrible choice, Odysseus steered his ship as close to Scylla's side of the strait as he dared, watching in horror as her 6 heads darted out and seized 6 of his remaining sailors, their screams echoing across the water even as the ship sailed onward. Unable to stop or turn back to help them, grief-stricken but alive, Odysseus and his diminished crew finally reached the island of Thrinacia, where Tiresias had warned them of the sacred cattle belonging to Helios. "We must not stop here," Odysseus warned his exhausted men. Tiresias spoke clearly of the danger these cattle represent, but his men, exhausted and hungry after so many recent trials, begged to rest upon the island despite the warning. And Odysseus, against his better judgment, finally relented, extracting a solemn promise from each man that they would not touch the sacred cattle grazing peacefully across the island's meadows. For a time, this promise held, but contrary winds trapped them on the island far longer than intended, and as their provisions dwindled to nothing, hunger finally overcame caution. While Odysseus slept, his desperate men slaughtered several of the sacred cattle, feasting on meat they knew was forbidden, but could no longer resist. The consequences were swift and terrible. Helios, discovering this violation of his sacred herds, complained bitterly to Zeus, threatening to shine his light instead upon the realm of the dead if his cattle were not properly avenged. Zeus agreed to punish the offenders, and when Odysseus's ship finally set sail once more, a sudden and violent storm struck them, destroying the ship entirely and drowning every last one of his remaining companions. Only Odysseus survived, clinging to broken wreckage as the storm finally calmed, utterly alone now, having lost every single man who had sailed with him from Troy, carried by currents toward one final island where an unexpected and lengthy delay awaited him. Chapter 4: Calypso's Island and the Long Voyage Home. Odysseus washed ashore, exhausted and half-drowned, upon the island of Ogygia, home to the beautiful nymph Calypso. She discovered him nearly lifeless upon her beach, and taking pity on his suffering, nursed him back to health, offering him shelter and comfort in her comfortable cave overlooking the sea. But Calypso's kindness soon revealed itself as something more complicated than simple hospitality. She had fallen deeply in love with Odysseus, and rather than helping him continue his journey home once he had recovered, she kept him on her island through gentle persuasion. And when persuasion failed, more insistent means, offering him even immortality itself, if only he would remain with her forever as her husband. For 7 long years, Odysseus remained trapped on Calypso's island, torn between the nymph's genuine affection and comfortable life she offered, and his own unwavering longing for his mortal wife Penelope, and the home he had not seen in nearly 2 decades. "Why do you continue to long for a mortal woman?" Calipago asked him one evening as they walked together along the shore, "when I offer you a goddess's love and eternal youth beside me. Penelope cannot match my beauty, nor can she offer you the endless years that I could share with you." Odysseus considered his answer carefully, for he did not wish to offend a goddess upon whose favor his continued survival depended. "You speak truly," he said, "that you surpass Penelope in beauty, being immortal while she must age as all mortals do. And yet still I long for home, for her, and for the son I have not seen grow into manhood. It is not reason that drives this longing, but something deeper that no comparison of beauty or immortality can fully answer." Calypso, though disappointed by his continued devotion to his distant wife, could not help but respect the constancy of his love, however inconvenient it proved to her own desires. It was only through the intervention of the gods themselves that Odysseus's imprisonment finally ended. Athena, goddess of wisdom and Odysseus's most steadfast divine ally throughout his long ordeal, pleaded his case before Zeus, reminding the king of gods how faithfully Odysseus had always honored the Olympians despite his many sufferings. "He has endured enough," Athena argued. "Surely it is time for him to finally return home, to reclaim his household from the suitors who have overrun it in his absence." Zeus agreed and dispatched Hermes to Calypso's island with a direct command that she release Odysseus and assist him in constructing a vessel sturdy enough to carry him the rest of the way home. Calypso, though grieved to lose him, dared not defy a direct command from Zeus himself. She helped Odysseus build a sturdy raft, provided him with supplies for the journey, and finally, with evident sorrow, watched him sail away from her island toward the open sea, and whatever trials still awaited him. But Poseidon, whose anger had never truly cooled since Odysseus blinded his son the Cyclops, spotted the lone sailor upon his makeshift raft and raised one final storm, more violent than any that had come before, determined to prevent Odysseus from ever reaching home at all. The raft was destroyed entirely beneath the storm's fury, and Odysseus found himself swimming desperately through churning waters, certain that after everything he had survived, he might finally drown within sight of salvation. But the sea goddess Ino, taking pity on his struggle, offered him a magical veil that kept him afloat, and Athena calmed the worst of the storm's violence, allowing him finally to wash ashore, naked and exhausted, upon the coast of Scheria, home to the seafaring Phaeacians. It was there, collapsed upon the beach in utter exhaustion, that Odysseus was discovered by Nausicaa, young princess of the Phaeacians, who had come to that shore with her attendants to wash linens in preparation for her own eventual marriage. Nausicaa, though startled by the sight of this shipwrecked, disheveled stranger, showed him the same gracious hospitality that marked the Phaeacian people generally. She provided him with clothing and directed him toward her father's palace, where King Alcinous and Queen Arete welcomed him warmly, offering food, comfort, and eventually, once he had recovered sufficiently, the opportunity to share his story. "Tell us," King Alcinous said, as they feasted together in his great hall, "who you truly are, and what strange fortune has brought you to our shores in such a state." And so, for the first time since his ordeal had begun, Odysseus told the full story of everything that had befallen him: the Cyclops and his terrible curse, the winds of Aeolus lost through his crew's foolishness, Circe's island and the journey to the realm of the dead, the Sirens' song and the terrible strait between Scylla and Charybdis, the forbidden cattle of Helios and the storm that claimed his final crew, and finally, the 7 long years spent as Calypso's reluctant guest. The Phaeacians listened with rapt attention, moved to tears by the sheer scope of his suffering. And King Alcinous, recognizing the true nobility and heroism of the man before him, offered not just continued hospitality, but active assistance in finally completing his long-delayed journey home. "We shall provide you with a ship and crew," Alcinous promised, "swift enough to carry you home before the sun rises twice more. Ithaca awaits you at last, Odysseus, and this time no further delay shall stand between you and your rightful home." True to his word, the Phaeacian ship carried Odysseus swiftly across waters that had taken him nearly a decade to navigate on his own. And as dawn broke on the following day, the shores of Ithaca finally, truly, came into view, not as a distant hope glimpsed briefly before disaster struck, as had happened with Aeolus's winds, but as solid, real ground beneath his own 2 feet once the ship finally touched shore. But even this joyful homecoming required caution, for Odysseus knew from Tiresias's prophecy that his own household remained overrun with suitors who had spent years pursuing his wife and consuming his family's wealth in his absence. Athena, appearing before him upon the beach, offered crucial counsel for how he might reclaim his home without simply walking into a trap that could cost him everything he had suffered so long to preserve. "Disguise yourself," Athena advised, transforming his appearance with her divine power into that of an aged, humble beggar, weathered and unremarkable. "Seek out your loyal swineherd Eumaeus first, for he alone among your household has remained faithful throughout your long absence. Through him, you can learn what has truly become of your household and plan carefully how best to deal with the suitors who threaten everything you hold dear." And so Odysseus, so close now to the home he had struggled for nearly 20 years to reach, prepared himself for one final test. Not a monster or a storm, but the delicate and dangerous work of reclaiming his own household through patience, disguise, and careful strategy. Chapter 5: The Return to Ithaca. Disguised by Athena's magic as an aged beggar, Odysseus made his way inland to the humble hut of Eumaeus, his loyal swineherd, who had remained faithful to his absent master throughout the long years of uncertainty. Not recognizing the transformed king before him, Eumaeus nevertheless offered the stranger generous hospitality, sharing what modest food he had, and speaking openly of his continued hope that Odysseus might yet return. "My master was the finest man I ever served," Eumaeus told the disguised Odysseus, unaware of the truth sitting before him. "I fear greatly that he has perished somewhere on his journey home. Yet still I hold to hope, foolish as that hope may seem after so many years of silence." It was in Eumaeus's humble hut that Odysseus was finally reunited with his son Telemachus, who had just returned from his own journey, seeking news of his father from old comrades of the Trojan War. Athena, judging the moment right for revelation, briefly restored Odysseus's true appearance before his son, allowing for a reunion filled with tears and disbelief. "Father," Telemachus whispered, staring at the transformed stranger who now stood before him. "Can it truly be you, returned at last after all these years?" "It is truly me, my son," Odysseus said, embracing the young man who had been merely an infant when he departed for Troy, now grown into a capable young adult in his own right. "Though I must ask that you keep my true identity secret a while longer, for I have a plan to reclaim our household from the suitors who have overrun it. And this plan requires that they not know I have returned until the proper moment arrives." Together, father and son devised their strategy. Odysseus would return to his own palace, disguised once more as a beggar, observing the suitors and testing the loyalty of those within his household before revealing himself and taking decisive action. When Odysseus arrived at his own palace, still wearing his beggar's disguise, he found conditions even worse than he had feared. Over 100 suitors had taken up residence, consuming his household's wealth in endless feasting, treating his loyal servants with contempt, and pressuring his faithful wife Penelope to finally choose one of them as her new husband, believing her original husband long since dead. Penelope herself, though she did not recognize the beggar before her as her long-lost husband, showed him the same gracious kindness she extended to all guests. For she had never abandoned the values of proper hospitality, despite the abuses heaped upon her household by the suitors who refused to leave. "Tell me, stranger," Penelope said, when she finally had opportunity to speak privately with the disguised Odysseus. "Have you perhaps heard any news in your travels of my husband Odysseus? 20 years have now passed since he departed for Troy, and still I do not know whether he lives or has perished somewhere far from home." Odysseus, moved deeply by his wife's continued devotion, despite so many years of uncertainty, could not yet reveal his true identity, but offered what comfort he could through careful, indirect words. "I have heard rumors," he said carefully, "that Odysseus yet lives, and that he draws closer to home with each passing day. Do not abandon hope entirely, my lady, for such rumors often carry more truth than mere idle speculation." Penelope, though grateful for these words, had grown weary of hope, repeatedly disappointed, and confessed her plan to finally settle the matter definitively. "Tomorrow," she said, "I shall hold a contest among the suitors. Whoever can string my husband's great bow, the very bow he left behind when he departed for Troy, and shoot an arrow cleanly through the aligned handles of 12 axes, shall win my hand in marriage. It is a task, I believe, that only my true husband's equal in strength and skill could accomplish." This contest, unbeknownst to Penelope, offered the perfect opportunity Odysseus had been waiting for. On the following day, as the suitors gathered in the great hall to attempt this seemingly impossible task, Odysseus, still disguised as a humble beggar, watched as one suitor after another failed even to string the great bow, let alone attempt the difficult shot through the 12 axes. Finally, when every suitor had exhausted their attempts and failed entirely, Odysseus stepped forward, requesting permission to try the contest himself, despite his humble beggar's appearance drawing scornful laughter from the assembled suitors. "What foolishness is this?" one suitor scoffed. "Shall we allow some wandering beggar to embarrass us further by attempting what we ourselves could not accomplish?" But Telemachus, following the plan he and his father had carefully arranged, insisted that the stranger be given his chance, and reluctantly the suitors allowed it. Odysseus took up his own great bow, the very weapon he had left behind 2 decades before, and with the ease of long familiarity, strung it without any apparent effort at all. Then, taking careful aim, he sent his arrow flying cleanly through all 12 aligned axe handles, accomplishing in a single moment what every gathered suitor had failed entirely to achieve. Before the suitors could fully process this stunning demonstration, Odysseus threw aside his beggar's disguise, revealing himself at last as their true king, returned after 20 years to reclaim what was rightfully his. "I am Odysseus," he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the shocked silence of the great hall. "And you who have consumed my household's wealth, harassed my faithful wife, and shown contempt for the ancient laws of hospitality, shall now face the justice your actions have long deserved, with Telemachus and 2 loyal servants fighting alongside him, and with Athena's divine assistance ensuring their success. Odysseus turned his great bow and soared against the suitors who had plagued his household for so many years, systematically defeating them despite their greater numbers, until finally silence and peace returned to halls that had known nothing but chaos and abuse for far too long. But even this decisive victory did not immediately restore Odysseus fully to his rightful place. For Penelope, cautious after so many years of disappointment, and false hope, was not yet ready to simply accept that this stranger truly was her long-lost husband, despite his remarkable feat with the bow. "Prove to me," Penelope said carefully, when finally brought before the man claiming to be her husband, "some detail only my true husband could know. 20 years is a long time, and many things can change a man's appearance and manner beyond simple recognition." Odysseus, understanding and even admiring his wife's careful caution, offered proof that only the true Odysseus could provide. "Our marriage bed," he said, "was built by my own hands around the trunk of a living olive tree, which I did not cut down, but instead carved and shaped the bed directly around its still growing trunk. This bed cannot be moved from that spot, for it remains rooted, quite literally, to the very ground of our bridal chamber." This detail, known only to the two of them, and utterly convincing in its specificity, finally broke through Penelope's careful caution. Tears filled her eyes as she rushed forward to embrace her husband at last. 20 years of longing and uncertainty finally resolved in this single moment of joyful, tearful reunion. "Forgive my caution," Penelope wept, holding him close as though afraid he might vanish again if she released her grip even slightly. "After so many years of false hope and disappointment, I dared not believe too quickly. Even when every sign pointed toward the truth I most wished to be real. There is nothing to forgive," Odysseus said gently, holding his wife close after 2 decades of separation and hardship. "Your caution only proves the very faithfulness and wisdom that made me long for home throughout every trial I endured. I would not have wished for a wife who accepted false claims too easily. Though some final complications remained, the suitors' grieving families threatening revenge, requiring Zeus himself to intervene and finally establish lasting peace across Ithaca. The long ordeal that had begun with the fall of Troy and stretched across 20 years of war and wandering had finally, truly, reached its peaceful conclusion. Odysseus was home at last, reunited with his faithful wife, his now grown son, and his aging father Laertes, whom he visited soon after to complete the joyful circle of family reunions that marked the end of his extraordinary journey. And so the story of Odysseus reminds us, across all the centuries since it was first told, that even the longest and most difficult journeys can find their way home, that patience and cleverness often accomplish what brute strength alone cannot, and that the deepest bonds of love and loyalty can endure even the longest separations, waiting faithfully through years of uncertainty for the moment when they might finally, joyfully, be restored. Rest now, dear listener, in the knowledge that every difficult journey, however long it may stretch, however many trials it may bring, can find its way at last to peace, to home, to the ones who have waited faithfully through every uncertain year. May your own rest tonight be as peaceful as the shores of Ithaca finally were after 20 years of struggle at last. for Odysseus and all who loved him. The end